this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Beverly Daniel Tatum, who will discuss her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and other conversations about race. Welcome to Rip Rap, Dr. Tatum.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. We must first say that your book is the featured text for this year's Ann Arbor Reads. What a wonderful opportunity to launch the kind of cross-racial dialogue that you urge in your book as a way to break the silence about race and racism. How do you feel about this experience?
Well, I'm tremendously excited and very honored that my book was selected, and certainly any author would be thrilled to know that so many people are reading what they've written. And the purpose of writing the book, of course, was to stimulate conversation. So I am just really, really excited about the fact that so many people are reading the book and talking about it in small groups, in their schools, in their workplaces, in their houses of worship. It's really very gratifying.
Yeah, there's a lot of those groups around town.
Yes.
I think it'd be helpful if you could share some of your background and then how you came to feel that it was time in this book to address the question asked hundreds of times, but posed one more time in the letter from a school principal in New Jersey. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria?
Well, I am a clinical psychologist by training. I was educated here, actually at the University of Michigan, and got my PhD, my master's degree and my PhD here at Michigan, and went off as a person ready to be a therapist, actually. That was my intention, to be, maybe to teach a little bit, but to be primarily a practitioner, a mental health practitioner as a clinical psychologist. But I had early in my career an opportunity to teach a course on the psychology of racism, and that teaching experience was so powerful that it persuaded me that this was really something that I should do. And as I continued teaching and talking with my students, who were, my initial teaching experiences were in predominantly white teaching environments, and as my students, both white and of color, talked to me about both how much they felt they were learning in my class, but two, how frustrating it was for them to have come through their education, K through 12, into college without ever really having had the previous opportunity to talk about issues of race or racism and how they were impacting our society. Those conversations inspired me to begin to have conversations with teachers, public school teachers, K through 12, to help them think about how they could begin the conversation earlier in the educational process. And as I was doing that, in part because my research as a psychologist was on the experiences of black youth in predominantly white settings, I was given the opportunity to come into schools and do professional development with teachers and talk about the importance of engaging in these conversations. And because a lot of those conversations took place in racially mixed schools, I found that as part of the professional development experience, teachers would ask that question. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And I would talk about my understanding of that from my perspective as a psychologist in terms of understanding what it means to be a young person in a race-conscious society, beginning to think about racial identity, the experience of sometimes being marginalized in majority white schools that students of color sometimes have. All of these conversations helped the teachers that I was working with understand why they might see this pattern of kids grouping together with shared experiences during their free time at lunch. But we also talked about, of course, how you can encourage cross-racial interaction outside of the cafeteria, in the classroom, after school, in other settings. But as I mentioned in the introduction of my book, I found myself being invited to give these talks a lot. And one time I was giving such a talk and I actually lost my voice. I came home with a case of laryngitis, and it was really fatigue, and I was thinking to myself, you know, I'm doing too many of these workshops, I need to slow down a little bit. And then there was this message from someone calling a school superintendent saying, please come and talk to us about why all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria. And in that moment, I realized that, you know, I'm just one person. I can't go but so many places. But nevertheless, these are important ideas, important concepts, and maybe I should write them down and help them spread in that way.
Well, that whole concept you've got about the racial identity formation, both white and black and Asian and Latino, is really helpful.
Well, I'm glad to know that. And in fact, it's important for me to say that I draw very heavily on the theories of William Cross and Janet Helms and other writers. And my real, I think, my focus was really to try to take ideas that were available to me as a psychologist, theories that I had studied as a psychologist, and make them more accessible to the average person who can use it in their daily lives in terms of understanding the interactions that they have across racial lines or even within your own family. As a parent raising two young men now, I found it helpful to have some understanding of racial identity development in my parenting of my children within my own racial group. So I have found these theories to be very useful. A wise psychologist once said, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory," and I have found that the theories about which I write have been very helpful to me, both as a parent and as an educator, and I wanted to share them.
Interesting that an administrator would contact you, wondering why, why kids are sitting there, because it seemed almost like it may be threatening or there's something being plotted, and you had a different view on it, which was it's community.
Well, it is community, but it is the case that in a society where we've spent a lot of time and energy trying to desegregate our schools, sometimes successfully, unfortunately often not successfully, this notion that in a racially mixed school you would have a population, black students, Latino students, quote, separating themselves, makes some people nervous. It seems to symbolize for some people a failure of their efforts to create an inclusive school environment. And in fact, it can be sometimes just exactly a signal that there are issues that need to be worked on in the school. It is certainly true that in schools where there's a lot of attention to creating opportunities for kids to come together with equal status, Gordon Allport, a social psychologist, wrote quite eloquently about certain factors that need to be in place in order to encourage good cross-racial interaction. One of them is that you bring people together with equal standing, and you encourage them to work cooperatively toward a shared goal, and you sanction that activity. Teachers, the school principal, those in authority positions, sanction those activities. Much like we see on sports teams, the coach wants all the players to interact together well. They're working cooperatively toward a common goal, which is to win the game. In schools where there's a lot of that kind of activity going on, you probably see less separation in the cafeteria. In schools where there's been little effort to foster that kind of cross-racial interaction, you're probably going to see more of it. But it's also important to say that even under the best of circumstances, there are still times when you want to talk to someone who speaks the same language that you do.
Well, I thought it was interesting that you talk about racial identity in terms of white people, and that they have to work through certain stages along the way. First stage is to accept that there is identity.
We don't always pay attention to those dimensions of our identity that are part of the quote norm. I describe myself as African American. I can describe myself as female. I could describe myself as Christian. I don't often describe myself as able-bodied, but I am able-bodied. And the fact of the matter is that, because it's the norm, or I could say I don't describe myself as two-legged. I do have two legs. But, because it's part of the norm, you don't think of it as something that needs to be mentioned. And if you are a white person living in a mostly white community, working and living in a mostly white environment, you might not ever think much about whiteness per se because it's part of your norm and it isn't being brought to your attention. But a person who is racially different, let's say in that context, an African American or an Asian person in that context, might find that often people are bringing to their attention, or just they're conscious of the fact that I don't look exactly like the other people in this environment, and that has some social meaning here. So when we think about the ways in which those messages get conveyed, some dimensions of our identity stand out for us, but other dimensions are less visible. And certainly for white people in a largely white environment, that may be a dimension of our identity, that of their identity, that is not particularly visible.
I like to go around and ask, before I do an interview, ask people, and it's really amazing. There's a lot of people that have just not thought about that. They haven't developed that kind of critical consciousness you talk about taking the past, the present, the future to a cohesive, unified sense of self. It's just amazing. And yet that's necessary in order to really understand what's going on. It's really helpful. And you also talk in your book about how this can help in carrying on a dialogue about race and racism.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because if we understand that we have different perspectives, that we've had different life experiences that have been shaped by our racial group membership, it helps, I think, understand where the other person is coming from, which is, of course, a critical piece of an effective dialogue, is to try to understand the other person's point of view.
Well, in a race-conscious society, someone who has those descriptors of being, black or Asian is going to interpret things differently because they're constantly having to deal with that. And actually, in Chapter 8, where you talk about the Latino, Native American, Asian, Pacific American identity development, you get into that, and then some of the examples of how there's differences in each of those situations.
Well, the historical context varies for all of these groups. The experience of African Americans is not the same as the experience of Native Americans, which is not the same as the experience of Asian Americans or of Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Cubans, etc. And so, as we think about these different histories, there are some points of commonality. Certainly the point of commonality around disadvantage, systematic disadvantage, limited access to education. Historically, there are lots of examples of shared history, though of course each group has its own unique one. But when we think about racism in our society, I think it's very important to broaden it beyond just black-white. Everybody's experience needs to be factored in, and we have an increasingly very multiracial society, and we need to think about those multiple perspectives when we talk about these issues.
Right, and in your book you talk about there may be some shifts ahead. What's the dominant majority of the minority or whatever. And as you were talking, I was thinking too, some of that depends on how each group entered, this country, and then what their possibilities were available for them. But we should talk a little bit about how this discourse fits into the discussion on affirmative action.
Well, I think we see certainly affirmative action continually under assault. In our legal system, I'm delighted that the University of Michigan was able to prevail, at least in the law school case, about its policies as it relates to affirmative action. Creating diverse educational environments is really important if we think about educating the next generation of leaders. So it is important in the workplace, it's important in our schools, it's important really for the good of our country to be sure that we are creating access to education and economic opportunity for all of our citizens.
Well, in those discussions I've been having with different people, the quality of the discussion and depth of it, as you point out in your book, depends on that critical awareness.
Yes.
So if they've not thought about it, they have all kinds of attitudes about what affirmative action is, and I'm not sure they even understand what it is. It's become something else in the popular discourse. And isn't necessarily a productive discussion because they don't understand the parameters of it.
Well, I would just say that it's hard to have a meaningful conversation about affirmative action without also an understanding of privilege. When you think about affirmative action as a way of redressing systematic disadvantage for those who have been targeted by racism, that conversation is only part of the story, because not only can we talk about systematic disadvantage, but if you're talking about systematically disadvantaging one group, you are also talking about systematically advantaging another. And so if you have not thought about the ways in which your group may have been advantaged, then it's going to be hard to appreciate a conversation about systematic disadvantage.
Well, as you say in your book, you see this conversation on race and racism is continuing, and that at every educational institution we must ask ourselves, how do we create and sustain school environments that affirm identity, build community, and cultivate leadership?
Well, I call these the ABCs.
ABCs, yeah.
Affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership. And they are important for every institution. I am currently serving now as the president of Spelman College, which is the oldest historically black college for women. And sometimes people say, well, you know, how do these issues of diversity apply at Spelman? You know, here is a school that's almost 100% black, not all African American, but certainly most of our students are of African descent, some of them from the actual continent of Africa, some of them from the Caribbean, the majority from the U.S. And when we think about even in that context, there are still diversity. There's religious diversity, there's socioeconomic diversity, there are groups who are going to feel more included, others who really need more affirmation because they are less included. I'm thinking, for example, religious diversity. Spelman College was founded as was founded by two white women who were missionaries, intent on providing religious education and a liberal arts education, ultimately, for black students. That is certainly a very noble mission that they embarked upon, and today, 123 years later, we are very proud of what their result was. But we are not a Christian institution in that we have students of varying backgrounds. The motto of our school is Our Whole School for Christ. That motto is an important motto. It recognizes the history of our institution, and at the same time, we don't want Muslim students to feel unwelcome. We don't want Baha'i students to feel unwelcome. So how do we think about affirming the identities of the students who come through our doors who are not Christian themselves, or who do not embrace or come from that particular faith tradition? I think there are ways to do that, but we have to be intentional about it. How do we build community? We want to have everybody feel a part of this ethos, part of the Spelman sisterhood, which is so important, and yet at the same time, we can't build community unless we're thinking about all the members of our community. And cultivating leadership, the C, cultivating leadership, is really important because you need to be able to engage effectively with people different from yourself. And so how can we say we're preparing leaders, which we do say at Spelman, if we haven't helped our students recognize how to connect across lines of difference? These are really important dimensions of any educational experience, and I think as administrators we have to take that responsibility seriously in terms of preparing the next generation for leadership.
Was it at Mount Holyoke you turned the chapel into sort of a multi-purpose worship opportunity?
We did. I did that in collaboration with the dean of the chapel, whose name is Reverend Dr. Andrea Avazian, and she and I worked together. At that time I was dean of the college and she was dean of the chapel, and we were working in a context of a very diverse religious community. I think something like 10 faith traditions were represented, and yet there was a large, very traditional chapel used by the Christian community and actually for other purposes as well, for large assemblies. Could hold about 1,000 people. And right next to it there was a smaller chapel that could hold about 100 people. And it seemed that given that there was this other large chapel, which could certainly serve the needs of any Christian worship gathering that was available to students, but there was no space for Muslim students to have worship, or for Jewish students to honor, to hold their Shabbat services, or for Hindu students to gather. And how could we create such a space? We couldn't build, 8 more chapels, but we had this space. With some creative thinking, we were able to convert into a space that was appropriately usable for people of all faith traditions.
I thought it was really fascinating because each group had their own space and their way of adjusting it. You took the pews out, I think.
We took the pews out. It was a small space, but once the pews were removed, it really opened up, and it was possible to create an altar that had that was flexible so that it could be used in traditional Christian worship for people who wanted a smaller worship space, but it also could be rolled away for people who did not need or want that kind of a pulpit arrangement. The Hindu students, for example, had a cabinet in which they kept the objects that they needed for their worship, but for those who would have felt the presence of such objects would have been a distraction, or maybe even not allowed at all as part of their faith tradition, the cabinet in which those objects were kept had doors which could be closed and locked and made, and thereby making those objects no longer visible to those who wouldn't want to see them. And there was a lot of creativity in terms of thinking about how to meet multiple needs with limited resources. And that is one of the things that even at Spelman we continue to think about. We don't have the same kind of religious diversity, not the breadth of it, that was my experience at my previous institution, but it was certainly the case that we needed to think about how to be more inclusive within the diversity that we did have, and how to do that within the resources that we have available. And in fact, at Spelman, we have a beautiful chapel called Sisters Chapel, which is currently being renovated, but at the lower level of that building, there is an open space which is being designed to, in fact, be flexible, so it too can be used as a multi-faith worship space.
I just thought that was so ingenious, and it also makes your point about the different ways that you can accommodate varying needs.
Yes.
In your book, you talk about this dream.
Yes.
About driving along a road that turned into rocks. Maybe
Yes.
you can explain it, because I think it's a marvelous image.
Well, this dream came to me when I was engaged in reading some articles about school administrators who were trying to create multicultural schools where all the students felt included. I was part of a panel, and it was my job to be the discussant for these papers. So I was reading these scholarly research papers about efforts that various principals in different school settings had undertaken to try to create really equitable learning environments. The papers were very interesting, but I will confess that as I was reading, I dozed off a little bit. And while I was sleeping, I had this dream. And it was a dream where I was driving along a highway, kind of like Highway 1 in California, which goes along the coast, and you see sometimes these signs that say, "Watch out for sliding rocks." And in the dream, I was in this car, and all of a sudden the car was up on a big pile of rocks. And I said in the dream, "What happened to the road?" And I heard a voice answer, "There is no road." And when I woke up, I thought it was the perfect metaphor for what we were trying to accomplish in terms of these schools, trying to create equitable learning environments for all students of all racial backgrounds. This is something that has never been accomplished in our society, or to my knowledge in anyone else's. And so we find ourselves with a vision of what we are trying to accomplish, but no clear road there. What we have is a blueprint, and I sometimes like to think of the ABCs as sort of markers along the way. We can ask ourselves, are we affirming the identities of our students? Are we doing what we need to do to build community? Are we trying to transmit the skills of leadership in a way that encourages our students to think about how to interact effectively with people different from themselves? If we are doing those things, I think we're helping to lay the road, but the road is still under construction, very much so.
Well, that was one of the things I really enjoyed about your book. It's not only commentary or insight into the social process, but you're always approaching it also from the educational, as a teacher, instructor, administrator, curriculum. This is sort of what you've done, but where are you going? What kinds of other plans do you have at Spelman and as an educator?
Well, I have to say it's just a real honor and privilege to serve as the 9th president of Spelman College. It is, as I know many of your listeners or viewers will know, the oldest historically black college for women. It's located in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have about 2,000 students. Those students come from all over the country and from several foreign countries as well, and we pride ourselves on 123 years of developing leaders for the 21st century. We are excited about the future of Spelman as we look forward, because we see the opportunity to continue a long-standing tradition of academic excellence, but also to focus on leadership development. We are focused on improving our infrastructure, as all institutions have to do. We need to keep up with technology and be sure that we have the resources we need to be sure that our students have the capability to take their learning and their education to the next level, being sure that we have the facilities, etc. We have a beautiful campus, but it's a historic campus, and that means really upgrading our facilities in terms of technology. We are concerned certainly about making sure that people know about what's going on at Spelman and be very visible in terms of the work that we're doing. And we are committed to providing exemplary customer service. And when we think about these things, academic excellence, leadership development, improving our infrastructure, visibility of our achievements, and exemplary customer service, it's easy to remember because it forms the acronym ALIVE, A-L-I-V-E. Spelman Alive, strong and vital in the 21st century. And that is really what I am excited about as we think about the future of the institution. But in terms of leadership development in particular, one of the things that, as I like to say, we know is that in the next generation, increasingly, women of color are going to be playing an important role. We already see the increased presence of women of color in the marketplace, in the workforce, and we know that opportunities for the women who come to Spelman and at other institutions will be expanding. I have been in conversation with corporate leaders around the country who talk about the fact that they need the talent pool that we are providing, and yet many companies and organizations, both for-profit and not-for-profit, are wondering about what they sometimes see as a kind of a revolving door. Women of color coming in but not being able to retain them, or not seeing them move through the ranks of their organizations in the numbers that they should. And so we are focused on really trying to have a better understanding of what is required for the leadership development of women of color, not just African American women, but women of color more broadly defined. And so are focused on that and have created a center at Spelman called the Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement. And this center is designed to not only provide leadership development for our students in very broad ways, and I could talk a little bit about some of those ways, but also to be a resource for people around the country, to essentially be kind of a think tank about leadership development of women of color. And we are launching all of this in a national conference, which is taking place in Atlanta, May 12th through the 14th. The title of the conference is Women of Color, Leadership in the 21st Century. It's our turn. And we are very excited about the fact that so many scholars and practitioners from around the country who have been doing research on leadership development or who have a professional or scholarly interest in the experiences of women of color in the workplace in corporate America will be with us to talk about those issues, and we're very excited about the women who will be coming not only to be presenters but also to be in the audience. So anyone interested in knowing more about this conference could certainly learn by coming to the Spelman website, which is www.spelman with one L, spelman.edu.
Well, thank you for this interview on Riff Raff. It's really been enjoyable.
Thank you for having me.